In this lesson, we're going to look at how we convert between fractions, decimals, and percents. Now, there are several different ways we go about doing this because we have three different representations that we're going to find equivalents of. But let's start with fractions to decimals. In order to convert a fraction to a decimal, we are simply going to do the division that we know that the fraction represents. So for example, if we have 3/8, we know that that represents the division puzzle 3 divided by 8. And when we do that division, we find that we get the decimal 375 thousandths. So the conversion from a fraction to a decimal is that easy. Just do the division. The second example you see in front of you represents 7 divided by 8. And when we calculate that, we get 875 thousandths. Notice I didn't do any rounding on those representations because when we do the division, that decimal terminates. So we'll use all of the digits that we see. Let's take a look at how we can convert a fraction to a decimal if the denominator is a power of 10. That means if our denominator is a factor of 10, 100, 1000, and so forth. In these cases, it might be easier to just use an equivalent fraction. So let's take a look at 3/5. I know that 5 is a factor of 10. So I'm going to find the equivalent fraction for 3/5 with a denominator of 10. And that gives me 6/10. Now this is why it's so important to say decimals with place value, because if you listen to what you're saying, you can do some of these conversions without a big calculation. This fraction now says 6/10. So think about what that looks like as a decimal. The tenths is the first decimal place after the decimal itself, and that simply looks like this, 6/10. You're actually saying the fraction and the decimal at the same time. For 7/20, I know that 20 is a factor of 100. I get there by multiplying by 5. So I'm going to multiply 7 by 5 also to get 35. Now let's say that fraction, 35 hundredths. That's like 35 cents. Okay, so just to recap, when moving from a fraction to a decimal, you can use the division problem that the fraction represents, or you can use equivalent fractions if the denominator is a factor of a power of 10. Let's take a look at converting decimals to fractions. We're going to use that same idea of reading the decimal with place value. And if you do that, you actually make the conversion as you speak it. So let's take a look at the first one. We have 35 hundredths. Think about that, 35 hundredths. That's 35 over 100. You just made the conversion to a fraction. The last thing to do would be to simplify. So we'll find that common factor for 35 and 100, which in this case is 5. So that gives us 7 over 20. And that is your simplified fraction that represents 35 hundredths. The next example says 125 thousandths. So think about that, 125 over 1000. We can simplify that. I know that I have a common factor of 25. So if I take 125 divided by 25, that leaves me with 5. And 1000 divided by 25 leaves me with 40. Okay, notice we can simplify again. Sometimes you have to simplify twice. So I have a common factor of 5 now that I can see. So I can divide 5 by 5 to get 1. And 40 divided by 5 is 8. So my simplified fraction for 125 thousandths is 1/8. The third example on this page says 1 and 25 hundredths. We have a whole number portion now. Well, that's really easy for us because that whole number is not going to change. That stays as the whole number portion. So there's 1. And at the decimal point means that you're going to move into your fraction now. So we have 25 hundredths. 1 and 25 hundredths. So now if we simplify the 25 hundredths, I know that that is 1/4 because they both have a common factor of 25. And now I've simplified the fraction for 1 and 25 hundredths. Okay, now let's take a look at moving into some percents. And we're going to start by going from decimals to percents. Now the idea of percent means per 100, for every 100. And so that kind of helps us think about our conversion. if we're going to move from a decimal to a percent, we're going to multiply that representation by 100 because 35 hundredths, for example, means 35 out of 100. Percent means out of 100. So we'll just do a little multiplication. Now when we multiply by 100, it's really easy because every time we multiply by 10, we shift one decimal place to the right. So there's times 10. We'll shift it twice, times another 10. That's times 100. So that means this decimal is represented by the percent, 35%. Same thing with 125 thousandths. We're going to multiply by 100. So we're going to move one decimal place, two decimal places. So that's going to give us 12.5 or 12.5%. And then the last example on this page, same idea. It's always multiplied by 100 to go from decimal to percent. So times 10 times 10 again gives us 125%. Notice because I had a whole number portion on that decimal, I wind up with a percent over 100%. So that's a good way to double check your thinking. Alright, so now let's take a look. Let's go backwards now. We went from decimals to percents. We're going to move from percents to decimals. So this is the opposite operation. When we moved from decimals to percents, we multiplied by 100. To go backwards, we're going to divide by 100. So that means we're going to shift the decimal twice to the left. Now remember, in a whole number, the decimal may not be in front of you, but we know that the decimal is always after the ones place. So we're going to take 68% and divide by 100. So we'll divide by 10, and then we'll divide by 10 again. 2 decimal shifts. So that leaves us with a decimal now in front of the 6. Okay, you can double check yourself by saying that decimal. That says 68 hundredths. That means 68 out of 100 or 68%. All right, let's divide by 100 for 83.5%. Means we'll divide by 10. We'll divide by 10 again. That means the decimal is going to wind up in front of the 8 now. 2 decimal shifts to the left to divide by 100. So we have 835 thousandths. And in the last example, remember the decimals after the ones place. If you don't see it, we are going to divide by 100 by doing divide by 10, divide by 10, and that's going to put the decimal now between the 4 and the 2. Okay, so it's 4 and 22 hundredths. Okay, sometimes we have to move from percents to fractions. Now at this point it's not really a big deal. So we're going to take that percent, we're going to convert it to a decimal, and then we'll write the decimal as a fraction. So we're going to apply 2 things that we have been talking about in this video. Let's start with the 68%. Remember the decimal is after the 8. When we divide by 100, divide by 10, divide by 10, we get a decimal of 68 hundredths. Now we're going to write that as a fraction now, so say it with place value. 68 hundredths, 68 over 100. And then we need to simplify that. And I know I have a common factor of 4 for both of those, so I'm going to divide 68 by 4, and I'm going to get 17. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So I've converted 68% to a fraction by using the decimal representation. The next example, we'll do the same thing. We're going to convert 83.5% to a decimal, and we already know from our previous examples that is 835 thousandths. So now that I've said that, 835 thousandths, I know I'm putting 835 over 1,000. And then I can simplify that with a common factor of 5. And that's going to leave me with 167 over 200. And the last example on this page, we're going to take 422%, divide it by 100 to get the decimal. So that's 4 and 22 hundredths. Remember, a whole number portion is going to stay as a whole number, so when we convert to a fraction, we're going to have a mixed number of 4 and 22 over 100. Notice that 4 is not in the fractional portion. And then when we simplify the 22 hundredths, we wind up with 4 still. That doesn't change. And I have a common factor of 2, so that would be 11 over 50. All right, let's take a look now, bouncing back and forth here. We're going to go from fractions to representing the decimal and the percent. So we're going to take what we have, get the other two equivalent representations. So we'll start with 3/10. Now this one's going to be easier to go to a decimal first, because if you think about it, we just said a decimal, 3/10. That 3 is going to be in the first decimal place after the decimal. 3/10. You just converted to the decimal. So now we need to go to a percent. And remember, to go to a percent, we're going to multiply the 3/10 by 100. That means we're going to do 2 decimal shifts to the right. So I'm going to take the 3/10 and I'm going to multiply by 10. Oh, I'm at the hundredths place. I need to annex a 0. I'll multiply by 10 again. So that gives me 30%. So my decimal representation is 3/10. My percentage is 30%. For 7/20, it's going to be easier if I use an equivalent fraction. I know that 20 is a factor of 100. I'll multiply both by 5. That gives me 35 hundredths. When I say that now as a decimal, I hear 35 hundredths, 0 decimal, 35. I just converted to the decimal. Now I'm going to multiply that by 100, so I'll shift 2 decimal places. This is going to give me the percent, and that gives me 35%. So my decimal is 35 hundredths, my percent is 35%. Alright, the last one on this page is 24/25. I know that 25 is a factor of 100, so I'm going to multiply both of those by 4. And 24 times 4 gives me 96. Now when I say that fraction, 96 hundredths, I have the decimal already. 96 hundredths. To get to the percent, I'm going to multiply by 10 and by 10 again, because that's multiplying by 100. And that's going to give me 96%. So I have the decimal, I have the percent.